Hey everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. Congratulations on surviving 2020. I have to apologize right out of the gate that it's taken us so long to get this video posted. It's been a crazy year so far. I guess it's been a crazy year for the whole country, but it certainly has been for us here at Mississippi State. I'll spare you all of the details. Suffice it to say, it ends with me sitting here late at night in a Superman shirt, which is not my normal attire. I just got back from jogging. In any event, we've got a topic to cover, and it's a really good topic, and I think we have a good video for you on it. And it is resolved. States ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. So as always, we want the video to be helpful. If it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. As always, the sources and timestamps are in the description below. And if you want, you can follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate for our just general musings and thoughts on life in general. So without further ado, let's jump right into it with just some basic thoughts on the topic. It is in many ways very similar to the nuclear arsenals topic from about a year ago in the sense that it asks us whether the world would be a better place if we didn't have a certain type of controversial weapon. I thought that was a good topic. I think this topic is even better in some ways. It's sort of like the nuclear arsenals topic got together with the predictive policing topic because that involves AIs and algorithms and things like that. And they had a little baby topic, and the baby topic is even better than the first two. So right out of the gate, great topic. It's about killer robots. I mean, what's more viscerally interesting and exciting than killer robots? I don't know. And more importantly than that, there are just so many fun angles you can debate, which we're going to talk about in just one second. So I have to say, I don't say this enough, credit where it's due. Great job, NSA. This is a fantastic topic. That's why for the first time this year and the first time ever, this topic earns our Hail State Debate seal of approval, which you can see here is an actual seal because of just all of the different fun ways to approach it. So like, first of all, let's just talk about the different ways to approach it, right? There's the factual technical side of the topic to master. Unlike nuclear weapons, it's obvious what those are. It is not immediately apparent to a judge or even to a debater who's researching this what an LAW is, how they work, what they could become in the future, what they physically look like even, right? And it's important to do the research and to master that and to have an understanding, and you will be rewarded if you develop a more detailed understanding of like what LAWs are and what they're not, and you develop the ability to explain that to the judge. But it's not just the weapons themselves, it's related technologies like facial recognition software and vulnerability to hacking and how strong are our protections on that. And it's especially true when you're debating in front of like lay judges or judges who are new to the topic, that you be able to explain these things in practical terms and that you not just be talking, in abstractions and jargon and technical stuff, right? Also on the factual side, there's the ability to talk about really fun, cutting edge, almost kind of sci-fi ideas like rogue AI, like rogue artificial intelligence. Is it possible that when we put an artificial intelligence into a weapon system, and we have an arms race potentially based on that, are we increasing the likelihood that AI is going to start learning faster than we can control it, doing things we don't want it to do, giving it weapons? Is that potentially creating a serious risk for the human race? And by the way, another fun aspect of this topic is that you absolutely can run plausible like extinction level scenarios, right? Like from the Terminator movies, or if you've ever played the Horizon Zero Dawn video game, the idea of machines taking on a will of their own potentially, or getting closer to that, or being more autonomous from us and becoming a danger to us is not at all implausible, from a debate perspective. So you really can run some pretty plausible extinction level stuff, not like running nuclear war resulting from like transportation policy on another topic. It really can be done viably here. There's also pure philosophy like just war theory, moral agency theories, and things like that. There's a lot of different ways you can go on that. There are also debate theory questions, like about what the scope of a fiat is. Like, what can the judge fiat? What can they make happen by voting for the affirmative? Do they, for example, by voting affirmative, does that mean that every country in the world is going to reliably forever forego lethal autonomous weapons? If so, then the affirmative is going to have a huge advantage because they're going to take away the need for other countries to consider, their parity and their ability to match, which is the reason why we develop most weapons in the first place. On the other hand, if you can argue that no, you don't get to magically make that go away with Judge Fiat, with just by voting affirmative, then there are going to be strong arguments on the negative that we can't ban it because, countries are not going to obey that ban anyway, and we need to allow other countries to defend themselves. So a lot of ground, not all the ground, but a lot of ground depends on like what you believe the judge's ballot does. Does it just make all of them go away, or does it just sort of create a general moral duty, right? If there is a slight downside, it might be that there's not a ton of existing empirical evidence about what lethal autonomous weapons do because they really, broadly speaking, don't exist yet. There are some exceptions that we'll talk about, right? But there's not a major empirical record. You can't go and say lethal autonomous weapons have saved X number of lives or cost X number of lives, right? Because they haven't really been deployed. But I actually think that that minus is kind of a plus in some ways, insofar as it requires you to tell logical, plausible stories about what will happen and what might happen and what's plausible. And that to me is more fun style of debating than just bashing people over the head with raw numbers that you don't really understand, right? That's always more fun. It was more fun for me when I was a debater, I'll say that. So I have two suggestions on this topic really quickly. The first one is, because it is such a broad topic with so many different angles, be a little creative. Maybe try something you haven't tried before. If you've never tried an extinction level impact, if that's something that's new to you and it's not just anathema, it's not just hated in your circuit, maybe try something like that. If you haven't run a little bit of debate theory and you want to run some about like what the scope of the judge's fiat is to maybe give yourself an advantage, maybe try something like that. Use this broad topic to maybe stretch yourself and try some new things as a debater. And then secondly, because it is such a broad topic, there is no substitute for doing your research. There's no substitute for reading broadly, reading every night, writing blocks, organizing your blocks, going back after your first tournament, looking over the flows with your teammates and just, synthesizing from there again and again and again and iterating upon that. There is no substitute for the hard work of understanding all the different angles, and you will be rewarded if you do that. And if you come in with just, sort of one case that you've written and nothing else, you're going to have a hard time, right? If you don't have a broad understanding. But that's just good debating in general, right? That's just being a good, well-prepared debater. It's all about the work ethic, right? And it's all about realizing that tournaments are won and lost not on the day of, but the week before and the month before, right? So at any rate, let's get right into the substance of it. We're going to start with definitions and some general framing issues, then move on to values and criterion, then affirmative arguments, and then negative arguments. Okay, so let's do some definitions, and maybe while we're at it, also do a little bit of factual background just kind of mixed in. I do think this is a topic where definitions have the potential to be moderately important in some rounds, maybe very important in a few rounds, because partly of the ambiguity as to what lethal autonomous weapon systems are, because they are not, broadly speaking, existent yet. Right. And also because of some ambiguity as to what it means for, quote, states to do this, like how many states do it, how permanent is it, things along those lines. And I think you can get into some nice questions about like what the judge is actually voting for there. So let's just jump right in and start, go a little bit out of order and start with lethal autonomous weapons, because obviously we want to have some idea of what we're talking about here today, right? So a very common one you see is from the United States Department of Defense Directive 3000.09. One thing to note about this, it does get mentioned a lot in discussions about this topic. It is a definition of a very slightly different term, not lethal autonomous weapons, but autonomous weapon systems, right? Now, broadly speaking, in 95 to 99% of cases, you can probably assume that these terms mean the same thing as a practical matter in the literature, but you never know when people will be nitpicky with definitions and rounds. So DoD in this directive defines autonomous weapon systems as weapon systems that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. In other words, you turn it on, you send it, give it some general mission parameters, go here, look for this, and it does not have to ask you, right, whether it's a drone, whether it's a sort of a track-based land vehicle, whether it's a torpedo or something out in the ocean. It can decide whether the things it sees and senses meet its definition. It can target them, it can engage and destroy or kill them, right? Now notice that the DoD definition does not include the word lethal, right? It just autonomous weapon systems. So if you want to, to separately define lethal, that's perfectly fine. I mean, I think you can, the Webster's definition is just sufficient to cause death. I don't know that this distinction is going to matter much in many rounds. The only conceivable case might be a case where the NEG would argue that maybe there are some autonomous weapons that are not particularly lethal, like maybe defensive, like missile defense systems, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And maybe they don't have the same risks as others. And if you don't ban them, then it's not truly a ban. I mean, you could get into some nice stuff about that. I think in most rounds, the DoD definition will be fine. An alternative, if you want it, is from the Future of Life Institute that it actually does define lethal autonomous weapons. as weapon systems that can identify, select, and engage a target without meaningful human control. So very similar if you want to use something that uses the exact language from the resolution. Now, a related background question, just while we're at it, right, while we're talking about them, is like, practically speaking, what do LAWs look like, right? And I think a fair answer to that is that we really don't know yet. And that's part of this debate. That's part of what makes it interesting, right? We have some general ideas based on, what's being researched, what they're modeled on, a few that have been deployed, but we don't really have any clear, like, physical parameters, like that's what one looks like, that's what they do on the battlefield, right? So Kelsey Piper in Vox in 2019 notes that an AWS would not look like the Terminator, right? The simplest version would use existing military drone hardware, but while today's drones transmit video feedback to a military base where a soldier decides whether the drone should fire on the target, an autonomous weapon, the soldier won't make that decision, an algorithm would, right? We also know that, broadly speaking, these types of weapons probably won't operate alone. They will probably be more likely to operate in highly coordinated groups and swarms, because that's really one of the major advantages of having an interlinked AI, right? The ability to coordinate units at a speed and with a precision that no human being, no commander could ever do with human troops, right? So Burgess Laird of the RAND Corporation explained in a piece in June 2020, lethal autonomous weapons, he calls them AWS here, are expected to operate in large swarms comprising hundreds or even thousands of small, relatively low-cost and expendable vehicles with network sensors and onboard computing. Fighting in swarms, AWS hold the promise of effectively returning mass to the battlefield, as they will be capable of rapidly and autonomously coordinating their own tactical movement, right? And so, this is a way of sort of saying that the kind of the nightmare scenarios that some people have about, big swarms of like hunter-killer, drones and things like that, like you see, in the Terminator movies, are not too far-fetched, right? These things are meant to operate together, and they are meant to operate in swarms, right? But I think beyond those things, right, those basic characteristics, it has an AI, probably will operate together, can really take on any physical form. I don't think you should assume any particular limitations. I don't think you should assume they're airborne or they do anything in particular on the battlefield, because here's the thing. What we're really debating about here is setting a precedent, right? Anything that a human being can do on the battlefield or in the sky or in the sea, we should assume, if we set the precedent of having weapons that are driven by AI and make their own decisions, there's no reason down the road that it can't apply to anything a human soldier does. So debating about the particulars of like what one looks like today really sort of misses the point. If a human soldier can do it now, and we accept the precedent of allowing an AI to start doing some parts of combat autonomously, then there's no reason to think that they won't eventually do other things that humans are currently doing, right? It's more a debate about precedent than it is about like physical shape of these things, right? And also, as another quick digression while we're talking about it, since we're mentioning putting AI, right, putting artificial intelligence in charge of weapons, it is really important that you take some time to understand like exactly what artificial intelligence is and what some of the risks are. Even though it's not a term in the resolution, it's a huge part of understanding the potential risks that LAWs pose. And there's a vast body of literature out there on the risks of like rogue AIs, like artificial intelligences that depart from their intended limited functions and potentially harm humans. We'll link to some very good authors on this. One example is Eliezer Yudkowsky, I think I said that name right, who had a really good piece in 2008 where he just explained in detail a lot of the risks of AI, not necessarily in the military context specifically, but about how we might expect the risks of AI to play out, whether it's like literally becoming sentient or misinterpreting its instructions or all sorts of different scenarios, right? And it's definitely worth reading that. But I think that the takeaway is, if you're thinking of AI in terms of, oh, it's just a machine, it's only going to do what we tell it to do, I think you're thinking about it too simplistically, right? Yes, the artificial intelligences we have today will obey simple instructions to the best of their ability. But the more advanced they grow, like the more useful they grow, the more we research them, the better they get at killing people, right? The more they're going to be able to frankly learn and adapt. That's the reason why you have them, right? And it's very hard to predict, as Yudkowsky and others note, exactly where that ends, right? It's because it's trying to predict the behavior of something that is in some ways going to become smarter than we are. Maybe not in all respects, but in some limited respects, it's going to learn faster than we do. And we've never seen anything like that on the planet, right? So that's one reason why you have these sort of realistic, sort of nightmare sci-fi scenarios, right? Yudkowsky, again, outlines a number of these scenarios, but one of the things he says is, look, one very plausible scenario is if you give an AI a set of parameters, right, and you don't explicitly explain all of your assumptions, that AI is not going to make the same assumptions a human would. Like, one of the things he says is that the unfriendly AI has the ability to repattern all matter in the solar system according to its optimization target. He's talking about a crazy future AI here, right? But here's what he says about it, right? This is fatal for us if the AI does not choose specifically according to the criterion of how this transformation affects existing patterns such as biology and people. The AI does not hate you, nor does it love you, but you are made of atoms which it can use for something else. The AI runs on a different time scale than you do, and by the time your neurons finish thinking the words, I should do something, you have already lost, right? So a practical analogy would be, if we tell an AI to protect humans and we're not more explicit about like what the underlying assumptions are, like don't kill anyone unless they're trying to kill you, which of course we could do that, right? But if we're not explicit, right, we could find situations where, sort of nightmare scenarios where an AI thinks, well, the best way to protect humans is to just kill every single human that I think poses a plausible risk to other humans, right? And you get the idea. If we don't think very carefully and very strategically, we could have a serious problem here, right? We'll talk later about this when we talk about the frameworks, but it's just important to understand that the ideas behind how artificial intelligence can go sideways and go rogue, and that there are credible sources, for example, like the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge, who absolutely say that the risk of rogue AIs is an existential threat to humanity. It may seem like sci-fi, but that's part of the risk, because as soon as we turn it on, we don't understand, we don't know yet what it will do, right? Anyway, getting back to the definitions, if we are applying this Department of Defense definition, which is essentially, you turn it on, it selects and engages targets without further intervention, that's not necessarily just going to include like super high-tech stuff. It also includes some low-tech stuff, for example, like missile defense, right? And there's actually a really thorough, well-done discussion of like the broad scope of what lethal autonomous weapons can be in a paper by the Harvard Law School Program on International Law and Armed Conflict, or HLSPILAC, where they list a bunch of different types of technologies, like all the way from landmines to probably like truly autonomous AIs with things in the middle like missile defense systems, and they discuss whether they constitute, or at least they give you some background on whether they constitute truly autonomous weapon systems, right? And it's a nice thing to have in your back pocket, right? It's a nice thing to be aware of, right? And the reason this might be relevant is because you could have some topicality fights and arguments. You could have, for example, people making arguments that there are existing missile defense systems that have the ability to look up in the sky, see a target, and fire on a second's notice without a human being doing anything based on their targeting parameters. These are things like the CIWS, or close-in weapon system, right? As well as the examples like the Aegis system or the CRAM system, the counter rocket artillery and mortar system. These are already systems that are in existence. They have the ability to pick targets without human intervention. And so one thing a negative might say, for example, is that, look, we have these missile defense systems that can pick their targets without human intervention. That is a lethal autonomous weapon system. If you ban them, if you do a flat ban, that doesn't just mean getting rid of like nightmare Terminator style robots. It means getting rid of missile defense systems that just protect bases and protect ships and keep soldiers and sailors from being killed, right? So there's an interesting little wrinkle there about whether low-tech systems can factor in here and whether that might be an advantage. Low-tech defensive systems might be an advantage for the negative. On a similar topicality-related note, it is important to understand that there is a robust debate in the literature about exactly what constitutes a truly autonomous weapon. There's a really good piece by Lieutenant Colonel Adam Cook in a 2019 paper that we will link to that kind of lays out a very basic, I guess what I would call like trichotomy, like triple dichotomy or whatever, of classifications of sort of autonomous to fully autonomous types of weapons. And the basic trichotomy, right, is human in the loop, right, which is a non-autonomous, human-controlled, aided technology, right? This is going to be a system where a human being selects the target and then an AI or an autonomous weapon system finds it, actually engages with it and destroys it, but a human being and only a human being is going to select it. This would be things like GPS-guided munitions and guided missiles. Also, depending on the drone type, many types of just basic drones could potentially be considered one of these. The next level in terms of being more autonomous is called human on the loop as opposed to human in the loop. And this is going to be where the weapon selects and can freely engage the target without human help, but the human is there. There is a human monitor there to potentially act as like a veto. In other words, there's someone always watching it, and if they see the weapon engaging something or someone they shouldn't, they have the immediate ability to stop it. So that would be human on the loop. And then the last one would be the truly autonomous human out of the loop system. This is one where you have, the weapon actually selecting the target, engaging, and there's no planned role for a human. There's no yes, no. They're just not expected to be involved at all, right? And one thing Cook notes is that there is a fair amount of ambiguity in the literature about exactly where to draw the line on what is an autonomous weapon. In particular, he notes that sources like Human Rights Watch consider both on the loop and out of the loop to be autonomous, whereas DoD seems to think that maybe only out of the loop would constitute autonomous. So there's a debate about whether, for example, you can have a human being watching with the ability to say no. Is that still autonomous? In other words, on the loop. So you want to be aware of that ambiguity when you're talking about different types of weapons, right? Whatever positions you take, you want to make sure you understand them. A little bit more quick. Now next, we got to consider the definition of the term states. Now I don't think the definition of the exact... So next we have to talk about the definition of the term states. I don't think the definition here is really the issue. I think it's fairly clear from context that we're talking about nation states because, they're really the only type of state that does actual military weapons development. I think the real question here is when we say the word states, how many states are we talking about? Which states are going to do this if you vote AF, right? So in other words, if you vote for the affirmative, what does that mean? Do all states enact a ban on lethal autonomous weapons? Should we expect that they will follow that ban forever? Is that even allowed under sort of the principle of affirmative fiat, right? And so we begin that by looking to linguistic interpretation. I do this a lot. You got to look to the wording of the resolution. And that is that the word states here is what we call a bare plural. In other words, it is a plural noun with no modifier at all, like some, most, or all to tell you how many. And there's a lot of literature out there about what you do and how you interpret a bare plural. But when we're talking about statements that propose rules and norms, the most common interpretation of a bare plural is that it refers to all of the members of a particular class, right? So for example, if there's a sign in the restroom that says employees must wash hands, right? Nobody thinks that means at least 2 employees or whichever employees want to. It means all employees must wash hands. If the rule says attorneys must be licensed by the state bar, it doesn't mean a couple of attorneys, it means all attorneys, right? And similarly here, if we view a debate resolution as a proposed rule, which is, I think, a fair interpretation, right? The normal way we would interpret states is all states, right? And that would have some implications for the debate, right? Normally what we would say if we were the negative would be, oh, well, that means you got to prove every single state should do this, so that's a disadvantage for the AF, right? But on this particular resolution, I actually think the affirmative wants to argue, right, that every single state is going to follow whatever norm we set here, right? And there's a good reason for that. And it's sort of like what we talked about on the nuclear arsenals topic, right? The main reason why countries develop weapons is usually not because they're just bloodthirsty and they want to go out and kill people. The main reason why country A develops a particular weapon, whether it's a nuclear weapon or a lethal autonomous weapon, is because they're afraid that country B, right, who they view as a bad guy, might get the weapon and they want to be able to keep up. That's the reason we have things like arms races, right? So, for example, the U.S. says, we understand there might be risks of LAWs, but we know that Russia's going to try to develop them, so we have to do the same, or Russia, who we consider to be a bad guy, is going to, basically outclass us in terms of their military, right? But if the affirmative is able to come in and say, look, as a matter of just how debate works, as a matter of debate theory, Judge, when you vote AF, every state in the world collectively, right? States is a bare plural, so it's talking about all states. So when you vote for the AF, every state in the world bans these things. Well, guess what? The affirmative has just fiated away the arms race scenario. They have just fiated away, fiat just being the judge's imaginary ability to make things happen. They've just made all of those concerns about keeping up with the bad guy, which is a huge consideration, maybe the main consideration in the rule. They've just made that go away completely. So there's going to be a strategic fight between the affirmative, at least some affirmatives. Some affirmatives won't do this, but some affirmatives are going to want to have the judge assume you just make all LAWs go away, because when you vote AF, all states are going to do this, right? Versus the negative, right? And the negative is going to want to sell the judge on the idea that no, that's totally unrealistic. All you're doing with this resolution is establishing a moral norm, but we know that countries ignore moral norms left, right, and center. They ignore them all the time. So even in the AF world where we establish this moral norm, right, you're still going to have a situation where some countries, probably Russia and probably the United States, are just going to ignore it, right? So there are going to be reasons why countries, even if they don't love autonomous weapons, have a moral argument for why they should have them to keep up with other dangerous, aggressive countries who do have them, right? And so, strategically, I think what I'm thinking is that the affirmative is going to maybe want to consider running sort of like a plan, right? And it depends on whether on your circuit people like plans, but maybe a quick observation at the top of the case that says something like, because the resolution refers to states, plural generally, we're going to advocate for a solution that applies to all states. And we're going to look at, for example, an international treaty that would ban, that all states would enter into, and they would all agree to ban them and they would follow it. And there are some good examples of where you could, run one of those. For example, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which we're going to link to, has a good sort of outline of what an international treaty would look like. And that would be kind of a slippery way, especially if your opponent's not paying attention to the framework of the debate. If you were to run something like that at the top of the case and just sort of imply, oh yeah, if you vote for this, these things go away forever. Well, you've seized a lot of ground there kind of surreptitiously if they don't think to fight you on that, right? Now, conversely, if you're the negative, I think in my case, I'm going to be arguing that no, that is not a realistic way for debate to work. You should prefer a more educational, a more fair form of debate where we look at arguments that exist in the real world. And in the real world, even if we establish a norm, right, that we're going to ban these things, we can be assured that some countries won't follow that ban, and you have to debate within that real world, right? A couple of more quick definitions. Ought obviously refers to general duty or correctness. There's nothing really to debate here. Occasionally look out for the sort of troll definition where somebody says ought means likely to happen. I'm not going to go into why that's a bad thing to do. Just don't do it. The other thing you can look for sometimes is people say ought means just a moral duty, which means that I don't have to explain how the resolution will actually happen. I don't think that really matters too much here. It's clearly possible for countries to enter a ban on these things. Countries ban forms of weapons all the time. So I don't think there's a lot of controversy about ought. And then finally, ban. The Collins Dictionary says, just to state officially that something must not be done, shown, or used. Again, it's pretty straightforward. The only reason it's significant is it's such a strong term. I think it pretty clearly precludes any sort of like regulation or limitation. A ban means that you just don't do them at all, right? The scope of the ban might be debatable about like, do we have to ban any research into them? Could we research them but just not actually build them? I don't know. There might be some debatable stuff there. But broadly speaking, I think it's a very broad thing. And it means that like limitation and regulation and things that fall short of a complete elimination, right, are probably going to be grounds for things like negative counterplans. So those are the definitions. I know it went on for a while. We kind of combined our factual backgrounds with our definitions. Now let's jump to some values and some criteria. Okay, so before we get to the affirmative, let's take just a minute and talk a little bit about values and criteria. Now, if you've watched this channel before, you know that I am not a big fan of being super creative when it comes to values. I think that the point of a value in a Lincoln-Douglas debate case is to be that sort of North Star, right? That thing that nobody can say is not a good idea. In other words, if you link your case to this, whatever it is, morality, justice, whatever, right? There should not really be much argument at all that that is a good thing that you've achieved. It's there to be kind of the generic, this is good placeholder, right? And that's why I stick to values, for example, like morality and justice and fairly conventional definitions like that, because I think this should be one part of your case that's not controversial, and you can be as creative as you want in your criterion or your standard for achieving the value, and certainly in your case, but the value itself should be uncontroversially good. So I just generally go with morality, justice, things like that. Now, in terms of the criteria, I want to look at some options you have both on the affirmative and the negative, because I do think that there is some capacity to be fairly creative with this. The first one would be sort of a lack of moral agency or accountability. And the core idea here would be that Lethal autonomous weapons are making some of the weightiest moral choices that can be made. In other words, the decision between life and death in the context of an enemy combatant or maybe an innocent civilian in some cases. And they don't arguably have the capacity to assume the moral responsibility for that, and that's deeply problematic. So if you want to look at a basic explanation of the philosophy underlying moral responsibility for actions, there's a really good summary from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we will link to that. But it basically says that in order to have moral responsibility for an act, you have to have two things. You have to have freedom of action, and you have to have understanding of action. In other words, you have to have real choice, and you have to know what choice it is you're making. And there's a strong argument that lethal autonomous weapons have neither of those. They don't have freedom because they're constrained by their programming. They can only do what their programming tells them to do. And they certainly don't have a meaningful understanding, at least right now. Maybe some future AI might, but their AI is basically limited to how to kill things on the battlefield, whether to kill things. They cannot understand larger context of like the conflict they're in, whether their purposes are just or unjust, whether mercy should be exercised in some case where killing might technically be allowed, right? And because of that, they cannot bear the moral responsibility for their actions. Worse than that is the argument that maybe nobody would bear the moral responsibility, the moral weight of the choice to kill, right? So Michael Horowitz in 2016 has a really good piece that we will link to, and he just says this: if LAWs malfunction or commit war crimes, there's no single person to hold accountable the way a drone operator, a pilot in the cockpit, or a ground team would be accountable today. This is potentially unique to LAWs. And then he goes on to describe a scenario where, let's say we deploy a robot in a counterinsurgency and they're supposed to clear a house, but something goes wrong and they kill a bunch of civilians basically in what would be cold blood, right? Who's responsible? Is it the programmer? Is it the commander? Well, what if neither one of them could have predicted that this would happen? What if they just made an honest mistake, right? You might hold them accountable in some way for being a bad programmer or for making an honest error, but nobody would be held accountable in a way that, like, go to prison for life, be executed or whatever, and what we would think would be commensurate with committing a mass murder or something, right? So this would remove the ability to have moral accountability for actions, which itself is troubling, right? This is nifty in sort of two ways. In one sense, it gives you kind of a non-consequentialist argument where you're not just pounding away on this is why they're bad, this is how we measure that they're bad. You just say this is inherently morally problematic because nobody's taking responsibility. But you can still use a lot of the consequentialist stuff that's out there because you can, make arguments about, and here's why this scenario is likely to come up. Here's all the bad things that LAWs might do. Here's the evidence for it. So it's a nice take for the affirmative. I also think the affirmative might want to look at a framework or a criterion of like avoiding existential risk, right? Now, avoiding existential risk is a very common approach in LD and policy where we're always trying to link things to nuclear war. I know we don't do that as much as we used to. It doesn't happen as much in LD, but as in policy, right? But it does happen. And this is a case though that where it's not a stretch and it's not crazy. And the basic idea is that, you start with the idea that any existential risk to humanity, any significant one, is the highest possible impact, right? And this is explained succinctly by Jonathan Schnell back in 1982, and he explains why extinction is an infinite impact. He says this: to employ a mathematical analogy, we can say that although the risk of extinction may be fractional, the impact is infinite, as a fraction of infinity is still infinity. In other words, once we learn that something might lead to extinction, we have no right to gamble, because if we lose, the game will be over, and neither we nor anyone else will ever get another chance, right? So the idea is, if you result in the extinction of humanity, you get rid of not only every human being that exists, but every human being that might ever exist, on Earth or anywhere else that we might go, which is theoretically an almost infinite number of people. They will never live, they will never enjoy anything, they will never achieve any value, whatever the negative thinks of value is, they will never achieve it. Every possible good thing that could ever happen goes away. And even if the risk of extinction is increased only fractionally, like 1/10 of 1%. Well, 1/10 of 1% of basically infinity, right, is still basically infinity, right? That's how, the infinity works, right? There is a more thoroughgoing discussion of this in a paper by Nick Bostrom from 2013. He's kind of the godfather of things dealing with existential threats. He's kind of a minor celebrity. We'll link to that, and you might want to take a look at it, right? But this is a really good framework because there is actually plenty of literature out there that reasonably, realistically discusses how these AIs could go wrong and how they are a realistic existential threat and how it does increase our possibility of an arms race, and it does increase our possibility of rogue AI, and we'll talk about that later. But if you've never tried a little bit more of an aggressive approach, if you're more of a traditional LD debater, this might be something you want to give a whirl because it is a realistic scenario on this topic. Now, on the negative, there are a bunch of good options too. The first one that you might consider could be something like just war theory. Now, a lot of people talk about just war theory as an affirmative framework, and it could be. There are some more sort of esoteric, nuanced authors that, apply just war theory on the affirmative side, but I actually think of it as a potential negative criterion, right? And so basically, just war theory goes back to people like Thomas Aquinas and many other classical theorists, and it's basically a way of assessing whether war, as tragic as it is, as bad as it is, can be justified morally. And there are two basic requirements in just war theory. They are jus ad bellum, which is a justifiable reason for going to war in the first place, and then jus in bello, right, which is justified behavior in war. And the one that matters here, right, obviously is going to be mainly jus in bello, right? Joe Carter of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission in 2017, lays out the two basic principles of jus in bello, which are discrimination and proportionality, right? Discrimination being the ability to pick between combatants and non-combatants reliably, and to not attack non-combatants, to only attack those who have a legitimate role in the conflict. Well, LAWs have shown already that they have the capacity to do that. Their technology is improving all the time. Their facial recognition is getting better all the time. So they seem to be able to, at least as reliably as a flawed human being, right, generally be able to distinguish and discriminate between combatants and non-combatants about as well as a human being, and they're only going to get better at that, right? And then there's proportionality, which is the idea that if some harm is going to be done to a non-combatant, it has to be proportionally acceptable. It can't just be like blowing up a city for the heck of it. It has to be a necessary collateral result of a justifiable attack on a combatant or on a legitimate military target. Well, that's a choice that's usually going to be made by like human commanders at a higher level. It's almost never going to be lethal autonomous weapons who make these broad choices about like what targets, are going to be acceptable in these larger terms. These are decisions that human soldiers rarely make themselves. They don't choose like whether to blow up the dam, they just carry it out. So in this regard, lethal autonomous weapons, LAWs, are not much different than normal human beings in that they don't really make the proportionality decisions. So the argument would be, look, if just war theory gives you this kind of objective, framework for deciding when behavior in war is okay and or at least acceptable, right? And LAWs can meet it as well as a human being can. They can discriminate between the targets, and they are no worse at being proportional than human beings. They do what their commanders tell them. Then why are they unjust, right? They meet the same objective standard that human troops can, right? About as well as they can. And this too gives you the ability to have a good philosophical framework that also lets you go talk about the practical benefits about like how good LAWs are at distinguishing between targets and how few mistakes they make and how they don't get tired and they're not racist, at least hopefully, right? And things like that. Another approach that you can use sometimes, I use this sometimes on the negative, is the old reverse Kant's categorical imperative trick. This is the idea that, Kant's categorical imperative is a theory that basically says that in order for something to be moral, it has to be something that you could generalize into a universal maxim. It has to be basically morally valid in all cases. And what you do is you basically say that this sets a test for the resolution, that the resolution has to pass. In other words, it's not like a normal criterion where I, as the negative, am going to fulfill something. I am going to give you a criterion and ask if the resolution passes it. Now, I've seen some judges who freak out when you tell them this because this is not how they understand a criterion to work. But if you explain it well to an open-minded judge, they'll get it, right? We're going to ask, does this resolution meet Kant's test of being a universal maxim? And then what you do is you basically go in and you say, no, it doesn't. Because while there might be some lethal autonomous weapons that are bad and dangerous, I can show you many cases where they are not. I can show you, for example, we'll talk a little bit later about purely defensive lethal autonomous weapons like missile defense systems that are almost incapable of killing human beings. What they do is they shoot down bombs and mortars and missiles to keep human beings safe. And they do meet the definition of lethal autonomous weapons because they fire without human interaction, right? And so the argument would be you have those and you have certain other examples of lethal autonomous weapons that are not particularly dangerous. And so if at the end of the round, Judge, you believe you should take it on a case-by-case basis, and there are some, like for example, low-tech defensive forms of lethal autonomous weapons, then you don't believe we should engage in a ban. You don't accept that the resolution is categorically true. And even if it's a good idea to ban, 80%, 90% of them, if you don't believe that the resolution is a categorically true statement, if there are notable exceptions to it, then under Kant's rule, you cannot say it is a universal maxim. Some judges are totally fine with this. Some judges don't love it. It's another possibility. And the last possibility would probably be rule utilitarianism. This comes from philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and it basically says we're just going to do utilitarianism. We're going to look at what creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? But instead of looking at on an act level, like each individual act, right, is this act good for humanity? We're going to look at which rules are the best, and we're going to ask if a broad rule against lethal autonomous weapons is the right one. And this could be a good way to segue into arguments about how like regulation would be better, right? About how these things are going to happen and this rule is not going to be effective anyway. So this is not going to be the rule that maximizes utility. We should instead regulate it, try to slow the rollout, try to make sure it happens in a safe and humane way, right? So those are some possibilities on the negative. Again, a lot of good possibilities. It's just a very diverse topic. We haven't really touched on even half of the things we could look at. There certainly are, for example, like critical race theory frameworks about the bias behind these weapons, and we're going to talk about those in the arguments. But that's all the time we have on values and criteria. So now, without further ado, let's move on and talk a little bit about affirmative arguments. Okay, so on the affirmative, let's start off with a couple of the arguments that we mentioned in terms of like the framework and the criteria and how to apply them as substantive impacts in the debate. Right, so the first one is the idea that violence by lethal autonomous weapons is intrinsically immoral because LAWs lack any moral agency or moral responsibility. And this goes back to the Michael Horowitz 2016 piece that we talked about a little bit earlier. And there are basically sort of two impacts here. One is that it is just intrinsically amoral or immoral to have the ultimate decision of life or death made by someone who lacks any kind, or something, right, that lacks any kind of moral responsibility. That in and of itself cannot be a moral act. And you can draw the line there, Judge. Once you agree that there's no moral actor making the decision to kill, you don't have to ask what the impact is. That is intrinsically immoral, right? But then you can also link to sort of a utilitarian impact, and you say like that we have this idea of moral offloading, right? If the killing is being done by something that doesn't have moral agency, that doesn't bear moral culpability, and arguably nobody does, right? That makes it much more easy, number one, to go to war, number two, to commit like atrocities and war crimes, right? Because, if the machine itself can't be morally culpable, right? It can't really be punished in any meaningful way. The programmer, might be, liable in some sense, but is never going to be held accountable in the same way as like a war criminal. The general that sent it in is going to be able to say, I had no idea they would do this. This was a malfunction or whatever. I didn't understand this, right? And so, the Horowitz piece is a good example. There's another good piece that we're going to link to by Robert Sparrow that kind of, from 2007, that expounds on this further and talks about how you have to have someone to be morally responsible, right? But if you think about it in practical terms, think about it this way, about the difference in how we hold people accountable for like intentional war crimes versus like negligence. So if you commit a murder and you kill somebody, you kill one person, right? You can either go to jail for the rest of your life. In some states, you can still be executed. The penalty is incredibly harsh. Like war crimes can involve life in prison, right? But if the closest thing we have to an accountable person is like the person who programmed it, right? Well, in most, nobody's going to program a machine intentionally to commit war crimes, right? So the closest we're going to get is maybe finding somebody liable on like a negligence theory. So like, whereas a murderer might go to jail, if someone like right now in the real world right now, if someone negligently designs, say, a car, and the car goes out and because it's defective, thousands of people die, right? They're not going to go to jail for the rest of their life. They're certainly not going to be executed, nothing like that. They might be sued into bankruptcy. Maybe conceivably in some countries, they might spend a little time in jail, but they're never going to bear anything close to the proportional culpability. And what you'd be arguing is we'll be applying this level of culpability, like tort negligence, like getting sued for bad design, is now going to be the most that we can do for war crimes. And that's just not an acceptable level of moral responsibility when we do this offloading. And it's going to make it easier to tolerate and accept atrocities when nobody actually has to go before a tribunal and be held responsible for it. Now, another more specific impact that's related to this comes from Tamburini in 2016, which is the idea that lethal autonomous weapons cannot comply with basic principles of international human rights law. Now, this card doesn't go into like details of specific treaties, but it just talks about how generally, human rights law requires parties and combatants to make distinctions, based on, common sense, based upon an understanding of what morality is, based upon a sense of like proportionality, like how much is too much, when should mercy be exercised. Those are requirements that come up in international obligations, and machines can't exercise those. So they are intrinsically unable to comply with some of the most basic requirements. If you want to name a law they violate, one of the best ones is the Martens Clause. The Martens Clause is kind of the catch-all fallback clause of international law of war. And what it says is like, look, if you're in a situation where no other law of war applies, the minimum law of war that applies is that you as a combatant, in terms of how you behave toward other combatants and toward non-combatants, have to respect the laws of humanity and the requirements of the public conscience. In other words, if you're not sure what law applies, the basic rule is you must follow, quote, the laws of humanity and the requirements of the public conscience. Well, a machine is nowhere close to being able to follow the idea of a public conscience or even having a conscience. So the argument would be here, these would be combatants that are per se, before they ever step on the battlefield. When I say per se, I mean inherently. They are inherently incapable of following the most basic requirement of international human rights law as it applies to war, right? And that would be sort of the more pointed, direct impact of the lack of moral accountability, right? So the second thing we talked about when we were talking about potential framing and criteria was the idea of an extinction level threat, right? To make this argument work, it's a very powerful argument if you can make it work, you have to do at least a couple of things. The first thing you have to do, right, is explain why increasing our marginal risk of extinction triggers the infinite or near infinite risk. And this is the Schnell and Bostrom pieces that we talked about earlier. Infinity times any fractional amount of increase, right, is still infinity, right? And then what you have to do is you have to tell a plausible story, a plausible link story, right, about how lethal autonomous weapons get us closer to extinction levels of risk. And luckily, there are some really good sources that can help you do that. First of all, because these ideas are kind of high concept, like rogue AIs, deciding they want to do different things, you really want to get experts saying just generally, hey, this is not sci-fi, this is not crazy. There's credible folks who think this is a serious risk, and luckily there are plenty of them. So the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge, which provides sort of a ranking of existential threats, actually ranks AIs twice, right? Not once, but twice in its top 7 existential threats to humanity. In other words, threats of extinction. Once for artificial intelligence generally, and a second one for lethal autonomous weapons specifically, right? So there are very credible people who are the most prominent researchers on existential threats that put it right up there at the very top. This is not hypothetical. If you just want raw credibility, that's a good source. Also, there's a piece from Turchin and Dinkenberger, I think I'm saying that right, in 2018. They have a really good piece on how militarization of AI drives existential risk up. There's a lot of good cards in it. We don't really have time to go through all of it, but I'd urge you to read it if you want to run an extinction threat case, because they're going to give you a lot of good cards that you can look at. But from the abstract, from the description of that, here's what they say they do in the paper. They say, we show that one of the convergent drives of AI is a militarization drive arising from AI's need to wage a war against its potential rivals by either physical or software means to increase its bargaining power. This militarization trend increases global catastrophic risk or even existential risk during AI takeoff, which includes the use of nuclear weapons against rival AIs, blackmail by the threat of creating a global catastrophe, and the consequences of war between two AIs. As a result, even benevolent AI may evolve into potentially dangerous military AI. The type and intensity of militarization drive depend on the relative speed of the AI takeoff and the number of potential rivals. So it argues that AIs, at least as we understand them now with our very limited understanding, have the potential to be sort of inherently inherently aggressive and inherently desirous of seizing more control. If you give a machine a task and say, do it by whatever means, right, it's going to try to seize the control to do it. Now, we don't understand how, a super intelligent AI would do this, but they're explaining how this could be one of the things that they do plausibly, right? There's also a really good 2013 article by Brian Tomasic on the Center for Long-Term Risks that talks about the dangers of an AI arms race and how they will lead countries to take shortcuts in the development of AI. So basically what he says is that greater hostility means countries are more inclined to use AI as a weapon. Indeed, whoever builds the first AI can potentially take over the world, which makes building the AI the ultimate arms race. A USA-China race is one reasonable possibility. Arms races encourage risk-taking, being willing to skimp on safety measures to improve your odds of winning. So as risky as AI is, generally, if we insert AI into an arms race, by putting it into weapons, we're going to encourage the parties, USA, China, and others, to try to go faster, to try to sort of skip on the safety steps, to move the AI ahead without really knowing how it behaves. And that's, potentially dangerous. That leads to a greater possibility of an AI that goes off the rails and decides it wants to do things that we don't want it to do, that learns faster than we can control it. This also goes back to the Eliezer Yudkowsky piece that we cited earlier, where he talks about, when we switch on the AI and it starts learning and maybe it starts rewriting potentially parts of its own programming, because that's what learning is, right? It becomes almost impossible to really predict what it's going to do because it's learning in a way that we are not capable of learning, right? And so what you might have to do, on a case like this is you might have to explain in very layperson terms, and I'm not kidding, think about the scenario of Skynet from the Terminator movies, right? Skynet was tasked with protecting humanity. That was its parameter, right? It looked at humanity, it realized that human beings were inherently dangerous and risky, and it decided the best way to protect humanity from being destroyed was to just destroy humanity in advance. Now that seems absurd to us, but if you give an AI that doesn't share our assumptions, and you're not careful, autonomy, and you give it weapons, and you're not very careful about how you instruct it and how you limit it, right? There's no reason to think it's going to share your assumptions about what it can and cannot do, which is why we want to go slow, and we don't want to accelerate the AI development process by making it part of an arms race, right? And you can imagine judges thinking, I think this is kind of implausible. How is this going to happen? And what you have to say to them is, number one, many experts agree this is plausible, but think back 100 years. In 1921, people thought it was a sci-fi fantasy that you could build a bomb that could blow up an entire city in one go. And now we have tens of thousands of them that could destroy the world many, many times over, right? So existential threats are things that by definition almost you cannot really imagine happening, right? A third point, maybe kind of an add-on to the second one is I don't know if it's a separate argument, but a related argument is that because of the risk and because we know so little about how AIs work, we should at least err on the side of caution for now. In other words, even if you don't believe that this is going to immediately lead to an extinction scenario like from Terminator or Horizon Zero Dawn or whatever, at minimum, you can acknowledge that we know so little about how AI will operate in the physical world that we should try and err on the side of caution. So AI researchers Douglas and White in 2018 note that AI are currently limited mostly to the digital world of information. Real-life applications promise to bring it into the physical world, but complex question answering and synthesis information is still in its infancy, right? And the way that you explain it is like, look, we have never encountered anything close to a near human level AI. It does not exist in the world. There is no such thing. We do not know how an AI will behave, right? And when we have an AI inside a computer helping advise us on how to do like traffic lights and stuff, that's one thing. But when we take them out and put them in physical bodies and put them in the real world, we need to be really, really careful, and we need to learn and be slow and methodical and see how they operate in the real world before we trust them in dangerous situations. And the way that you would say this is kind of a memorable tagline, and memorable taglines are important in debate. Don't underestimate them. They are very helpful, not just with lay judges, but with all judges, because they help explain concepts. But a memorable tagline would be, look, don't you think it would be wise for us to just, before we do the AIs in bodies that have machine guns and bombs and missiles, maybe we should put them in other bodies first and see how they operate. Maybe we should see how the AI waiter works, right? Or the AI auto mechanic works, or the AI doctor works, and let those operate and test out the kinks and fix the problems and see if they're safe before we create the AI with the literal ability to commit mass murder on a genocidal societal scale, right? So what we do is we ban for now. We ban for the next decade, next 2 decades, whatever, until we have done the research on AI and we know how to put an AI in the physical world. That is what Douglas and White are talking about how putting AIs in the physical world is brand new. We need to ban them until we know how AIs operate in the physical world. Err on the side of caution until we know how that's going to work. That's a pretty powerful argument if you can get the judge to buy that a temporary ban is still a ban. That's I think a good angle. Now there are some more practical advantages, like less high concept, more practical advantages of a ban. So the first one is going to be that it removes that having LAWs removes disincentives for war. In other words, LAWs make it easier to go to war, and this is a nice preempt for a lot of narrow neg arguments about like saving lives. So Human Rights Watch in 2012 points out advances in technology have enabled militaries to reduce significantly direct human involvement in fighting wars. Removing humans from combat entirely could be a step too far. Leaders might be less reluctant to go to war if threats to their own troops were reduced or eliminated. The prospect of fighting wars without military fatalities would remove one of the greatest deterrents to combat, right? Better yet, later on, Amoroso and Tamburini in 2017 talk about how, quote, popular outrage stemming from the return of flag-draped coffins represents a significant incentive for representatives sitting in parliaments to exert meaningful control over the use of war powers. In other words, as tragic as war casualties are, one thing they do is they serve to disincentivize countries and politicians who run those countries from just going to war willy-nilly. And when the cost of war is simply that you send your robots out there and the cost is purely in dollars, right, then the incentive is going to be a lot weaker. Again, if you want to talk about kind of taglines and catchphrases, if you thought, thinking back to the Gulf War, which is before a lot of your times, and the second Iraq War, there was a slogan called "No blood for oil." We shouldn't go to war and trade American blood for oil. Well, just imagine if U.S. politicians ignored that slogan, right, and went to war anyway, and they did, right? Imagine how willing they're going to want to be to go to war when you don't even have to pay for the oil and blood, at least not your blood, right? At least not American blood, right? You just send the robots over, they take over, and there's no real cost except financial, right? That's a frightening thought in terms of incentivizing war, right? Another practical advantage is the risk of hacking, right? Now pretty much everything on this, this is something I actually saw heard from people judging rounds at a tournament this past weekend. Basically, all the cards on this say is that there is a risk of hacking. In other words, lethal autonomous weapons, like other military technologies, are connected on networks, whether they're, usually wireless networks of some sort, and they are vulnerable to hacking, right? And I think, it's probably not an argument that's super strong by itself. I wouldn't run a hacking case like by itself, but I think it is a good change of pace argument. If you're running a utilitarian AF case, I think you do have the ability to kind of sort of pull back. And if you're talking about like military strategy and you're talking about casualties, this is a good way to sort of pull back and make your opponent spend time addressing something else, right? And it's also a partial block to claims about AIs, so allegedly not making mistakes and not getting frustrated and not messing up in combat. You can say, well, maybe they don't. But one thing regular human troops can't do is they can't be hacked in the middle of a battle and suddenly go from being your troops to being the other side's troops, right? And, an argument would be is until we're very, very confident that hacking is not possible, a ban is appropriate. I don't know if this is a round winner by itself, but it's enough of a change of pace. It requires taking some time out. It's worth noting, right? Another potential argument is risk of terrorism. This is the idea that by creating and fostering the technology behind lethal autonomous weapons, it's just like any other technology, nuclear weapons, landmines, small arms, whatever, as it becomes more proliferated in the world, it's going to get easier and easier and cheaper to get. So there's a really good piece, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, by Jacob Ware in 2019 called Terrorist Groups, Artificial Intelligence, and Killer Drones. If you want to run a case about how this is going to facilitate better, more efficient, cheaper terrorism, this is a really good piece. You can read it and almost write the case from that. The real question is not, could terrorists use LAWs? Of course they could. The real question is, why would a ban make that less likely? And this article actually provides a good answer. It's like, number one, it's going to eliminate or dramatically reduce state research. And these terrorists generally are not as good at developing technology on their own. So this is going to slow or stop them from having the technology. And he says, number two, even terrorists, as bad as they are, generally tend to pay some attention to international norms. Like, chemical weapons are not frequently used by terrorists because there's a huge international stigma on using them, right? They sometimes are, but it's very rare. So the idea would be that by making it, illegal internationally to use this, by having an international ban, it would make it less likely. Even terrorists want to be viewed sympathetically by the public, right? By the people that they're trying to fight on behalf of, right? So this is going to arguably make that less likely. So if you want to run that, that's Jacob Ware 2019, and we'll link to that. And then lastly, there is the argument relating to systemic racism or systemic, racial bias. This is really powerful. There were a couple of good angles here. Both of them come from a piece, as you can see here, by Haley Ramsey Jones and a number of others in 2019. Basically, what I took from this paper is a couple of angles. One is narrow and one is broader. The narrow one would be just like the practical biases that are built into the software of these things. In other words, the racial biases of the programmers make their way into the machine itself. But also things like facial recognition software, apparently, at least according to this article, have greater difficulty appropriately recognizing the faces of non-white people, black and brown people, right? Maybe that's because a lot of them were programmed by white people. I don't know. Maybe they used white people as samples. I have no idea why that would be the case. But there is a bias there in terms of their ability to correctly identify targets. The broader argument beyond that, like technical defect, is the idea that if you don't have moral responsibility, overwhelmingly right now, technologies that are similar to LAWs, like drones, the killing they do is overwhelmingly in the world right now not of like white North Americans, right, or Europeans. It is overwhelmingly of like brown and black people in places like the Middle East, right? And if we take any moral, right now there is low moral responsibility for that, but if we take all moral responsibility, or at least the vast majority of it, away by having no human being have to even make the call for the drone to fire, right, we're just further systematizing like systems of violence against already oppressed people, right? There is literally no human being that has to bear the responsibility for this racially biased violence. And I think that's a powerful approach. So as you can see, a lot of good angles for the affirmative. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about some of the arguments for the negative. Okay, so let's bring it on home then with some arguments on the negative. We'll start a little bit small with some of the smaller impacts and then kind of build up to some of the bigger ones, okay? So the first one would be the idea that lethal autonomous weapons can help reduce bloated military budgets. And so this comes from General Robert Cohn of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command in a paper in 2014 that the Army could reduce a brigade of soldiers from 4,000 to 3,000 soldiers without a reduction in readiness by spending more on robots. He notes that in an advanced country like the United States, where we spend about $13.34 trillion over the last 20 years, or more than 15% of our budget, this could be a tremendous impact. And he talks about the different costs as well, like the specific costs of maintaining a lethal autonomous weapon, which is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars total to build and maintain, versus soldiers, which cost in some cases close to $1 million a year, in some cases depending on the location, to maintain a soldier, send them there and maintain them in a combat zone. So the cost is dramatically lower. Now, I wasn't able in my research to find anything that directly linked like reducing military spending to, say, for example, increasing spending on things like schools and education and infrastructure. That's a questionable idea, but you might be able to find cards that directly sort of show that link. But at the end of the day, it's saving money. You probably would want to try to link that to having the money available. The trillions and trillions of dollars we spend, 15% of our budget in the United States, for example, on military spending being reduced and having that available for things that are more like humanitarian, more egalitarian in nature. I'll leave it to you if you want to run that. But there is no doubt that LAWs are cheaper than the average soldier. There's plenty of evidence. Cone is a good place to start on that. Now, sort of bumping up from that is a core argument that I think that almost every negative is going to want to run, which is the idea that LAWs save lives. And the key piece on this is from Ronald Arkin in the IEEE Spectrum from 2015. And it's basically a piece that just sort of explains the rationale for why lethal autonomous weapons will be better at saving not only the lives of individuals who are, they're replacing, right, the soldiers that they're replacing, but also civilians and even fighters on the other side, right? Now, the problem with this is, as we said, you really don't see widespread deployment of truly autonomous weapons. There are some arguments, for example, like Israel's Harpy system might constitute one of those. We've said earlier that certain missile defense systems like Aegis might constitute those, but we're not really able to have a statistical analysis of like, here is a combat situation with LAWs and here's one without, and here's how many civilians were killed. There's no way to do that now. So the thing that you have to do, and this is part of being a good debater, is telling a linked story, like telling a story about, like, as a matter of logic and a matter of sources and things like that, about why it is plausible and logical that LAWs will be less lethal. And luckily, Arkin does a really good job of that. He has some bullet pointed notes. First of all, he talks about the ability to act conservatively, right? The ability to not put self-preservation above all else. And he gives some examples on this, but I actually think it's worth me, giving some examples as well, which is that, yeah, and I think giving a judge an illustration like this is actually really, really important. Imagine a situation where a unit is pinned down in a civilian populated area by enemy forces, right? And it is abundantly clear that to get out, they're going to have to do some destruction. They're going to have to do some fighting and shooting and maybe blowing things up to get the unit out of that area, right? And when that happens, it is very, very likely that a significant number of civilians are going to die. Well, if it's a human unit, right? A unit of human soldiers, right? There is no way in the world any commander is going to tell them, I'm sorry, you just have to die. They're going to shoot their way out. That's going to be acceptable under the laws of war, right? That is going to be something that no commander would tell them not to do ever. We see them as having a moral right to try to survive, and they will. And that's just, in our view, okay. If you are a group, like a unit of lethal autonomous weapons in that same situation, however, it might very well be that the commander could very plausibly decide it's not worth it. We'll just let them be destroyed. And there's nothing wrong with that. No one sees a moral question about that. Heck, depending on how advanced they are, they themselves might be able to decide we are going to stop resisting, or at least we're not going to try to get out. We're not going to actively defend actively fight our way out, right? And potentially let ourselves be destroyed because, again, we just don't want to kill an inordinate number of civilians. That is something that this idea that Arkin has of not having to put your own survival above all else could very easily mean situations where you don't have to accept civilian casualties, right? So that's a good, plausible story that you can tell in lieu of statistics, and that's something the negative is going to have to do. Also, he makes the obvious point that unmanned robotic systems can be designed without emotions that cloud their judgment, result in anger and frustration. We'll come back to that, but the basic idea is a lot of war crimes and atrocities that you see throughout history are committed by angry, frustrated, sometimes defeated, sometimes victorious troops that have watched bad things happen to their buddies, right? And they just lose it, right? They just lose their attachment to like the laws of war and the laws of engagement, and they do awful things to other combatants, to prisoners of war, to civilians. We'll talk in a second about how those things happen, but this is a really good point from Arkin, right? Another thing is that, intelligent electronic systems can integrate more information from more sources far faster. So, for example, you'll have fewer situations like a soldier. There are stories of people who died at the end of wars in the past after the treaty had been signed, right? Now, that's an extreme example, but these are systems that are so interlinked that they can know the second the objective is achieved, right? They can know exactly when, the decision has been made to pull back without any delay whatsoever, without ever, having to wait for more information. So as soon as, for example, a threat goes away or an objective has been achieved, they can stop using force that is at that point unnecessary, right? And another thing he points out, which is great, which is that they can act as objective, impartial monitors, right? If you are a human being operating in a unit of other human beings, there is incredibly strong peer pressure not to rat them out, not to be the whistleblower if you see violations of human rights. But if we begin to integrate lethal autonomous weapons, that are constantly observing everything around them, probably almost certainly recording it, right? They become almost sort of like body cameras on police, right? In the sense that they are recording and potentially, if they're advanced enough, they might be able to intervene and like tell troops, you shouldn't do that. But even if they don't, they can serve as monitors, right? Impartial monitors that don't feel like peer pressure to go along and things along those lines, right? So on a related note to that, and this may be a separate argument, it might be a block to a common affirmative argument, is the idea that LAWs actually reduce bias and reduce problematic human behavior. So we talked earlier about how there's this systemic racism argument on the app that we're going to see, sort of racial biases manifested in lethal autonomous weapons. But Arkin, in an earlier piece, Arkin's a great author on this, by the way, you should read all his stuff. But in 2008, he pointed out that human soldiers, absolutely have a terrible record when it comes to human rights. He noted that 10% of U.S. soldiers and Marines were thought to have mistreated civilians in Iraq. Only 38% of Marines said that they agreed that non-combatants should be treated with dignity and respect, and an astonishing 17% of soldiers said that all non-combatants should be treated as insurgents. In other words, we should presume that non-combatants are basically combatants and treat them the same and maybe kill them, right? Well, these are incredibly disturbing and incredibly problematic statistics. We can assume that soldiers, because they're like anybody else, are just as likely, for example, to be racist as other people, and racism is a real problem in the world. We can assume that because they are fighting in a war, that their bias against the people they're fighting against, like not the combatants, but like the people groups, will go up. I will tell you that, my grandfather, I thought, was otherwise a very, very honorable man. He passed away, but he fought in the Pacific in World War II. Until his dying day, he had, and this is tragic, but he held on to a bias against Japanese people because he fought against Japanese folks in the Pacific. And that's just the reality of human psychology. An otherwise decent person with this terrible flaw, right, that machines don't have, right, And so the argument would be, not only do LAWs not make racism and racial bias worse, they are arguably the only way that we can fight back against them, because machines don't have these toxic beliefs, right? They are not racist. They don't get enraged when their comrades are killed, right? They can be programmed to follow the highest ideals of military service and do it every single time. And moreover, with a human being, right, we know that there are certain racial and cognitive, racial biases built into our subconscious, unfortunately. You cannot go into a human being's brain and lay it out on a computer screen, right, and pick it apart and say, there's where the racism is, let's change the code there. But you absolutely can do that with the programming in an AI. So while you can say, look, Judge, I concede that in the first generation of AIs, it might be that some of the racial bias of their programmers might make their way in, just like you have racial bias in regular soldiers. The difference is, with the LAW, if we see that happen, we can go in, lay the code out, try and figure out where it's coming from. Like, where in the code are we making poorer choices when it comes to people with brown faces or something, and we can try to fix it. So there's at least a chance that we can fix it with LAWs, whereas if we look at the 10,000-year history of humanity, right, since we started being a dominant species on the planet, it doesn't seem possible to quickly remove that from human beings, right? And if you want to give examples, you can talk about how the history of human soldiers includes, war atrocities and war crimes by the Nazis and the Russians and Poland and millions of other things. And you can even look to soldiers from countries that knew better, right? The United States in World War II, right? There are credible allegations that U.S. soldiers systemically raped women in Okinawa, an island, a Japanese island during World War II, and burning down Vietnamese villages in 1960s, and other, allegations of war crimes against members of the coalition in Iraq. And I say these things not to pick on the United States or be like anti-American or anything. I say these because these are countries that, generally speaking, are expected to know better, to not totalitarian conquerors like the Nazis. And yet their own soldiers, there's credible allegations that in a fair number of cases, certainly not all soldiers, we're not trash talking our armed services here by any stretch, but some still do awful things because I'm not excusing it, but because they're imperfect human beings with biases and flaws and rage and anger and things like that, right? Now, the other thing about the Arkin article is that it nicely links to the idea that the impact is really just that the ban is premature. If we ban these technologies, right, then we're never going to get to find out how much better LAWs could be at not being biased and tired and afraid and panicky and all the other things that human beings can be on the battlefield, right? So even if we don't want to deploy them in mass, we should keep researching them, keep developing them, maybe deploy them slowly on a trial basis so we can see. Because if we don't, we're just going to get rid of them forever and lose out on any of these potential advantages. It is premature to do this. this. And that segues into another argument, which is that regulation is a better option, right? I think this is an important argument that a lot of negatives can use, which is that a ban is just excessive, right? So if you want to argue that we should preserve some of these advantages, like saving lives, like being less biased, like killing fewer civilians, right? You need kind of a coherent argument as to how that's going to happen. Are we just going to throw up our hands and do nothing and say we accept the risks of AI? And I don't think you have to do that, right? I think, again, Arkin, he's a great author. He has another piece from 2019 that lays out kind of the scope of how a potential regulation, right, of these things, might work. And he talks about how there essentially might be like a treaty where states agree to like a moratorium where we pause sending these things out to the battlefield, but we don't pause research. We don't pause developing them. So we're not banning them, right? We're just a moratorium on actually deploying them in combat, right? We have verification procedures to show that you're not building up mass numbers of them. And we do like sharing of research and development so we can learn what each other are doing, at least if you're willing, right? And the net advantage of this regulation approach would be, look, number one, as we're going to talk about in a second, it's realistic. It's plausible. Like a ban is just not going to happen. It's going to be some states doing whatever they want and other states having nothing. And that's going to be wildly asymmetrical, and that's bad. So number one, it's just more pragmatic. It works in the real world. And number two, if you sell judges on the idea that rogue states will just ignore the ban anyway, they will ignore the ban. They might actually follow a moratorium that sort of slows things down. And that lets us avoid situations like, for example, speeding it up into an arms race and having risks of rogue AI, right? And we still have at least the potential, right, to have the benefits of fewer casualties, fewer civilian deaths. And look, you can say, look, if at the end of the day we do this moratorium a couple of times and we get down the road and we see that, there's just no way we can do this, these things aren't working out, right? Well, at that point, then 15, 20 years from now, whatever, then we can talk about a ban, but now it's premature. We should instead regulate it. We should slow down and tap the brakes, but not hit full stop and throw it in reverse and never go back again, right? We should see what advantages we can get, like with a moratorium or a pause or a treaty that regulates them as opposed to banning them, right? Now that relates to the idea that bans don't work, right? And this assumes that you win the idea that the AF cannot fiat magically a world where there is an international global treaty and every country bans it and follows it. And you have to win sort of as the negative, the idea that, yes, Judge, you can vote for a moral obligation, right? But countries, that's what LD is, value debate, right? We're debating about morals, right? So you can vote for a moral obligation, Judge, but at the end of the day, you can't vote for a fantasy world where every single country in the world always follows its moral obligation. When we look, for example, to nuclear weapons, we have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that bars countries that don't already have nuclear weapons from developing them. Well, North Korea, Iran, Israel, and many other countries historically have completely flouted that, have tried to develop their own nuclear weapons. It simply doesn't work, right? And so you just sort of explain the decision calculus and you say, look, Judge, you can talk about all the moral obligations you want, but if a country really feels like they need a particular weapon or they're at risk of being destroyed by their, malicious neighbor, they're going to do it, right? And you can't fiat that away. If you claim the ability to fiat that away, then we're just living in magical debate world. This is not an educational debate. It has nothing to do with the real world decision calculus, right? And it's not really, how LD ought to work. It's kind of a theory argument there, right? So, for example, West and Karsten and Brookings 2019 have a really good, piece that argues about why bans don't work. Although many activists would call for the outright ban of autonomous lethal weapons, a total ban would be difficult to enforce. The integration of AI as a core part of national defense strategies in the U.S., China, Russia, and other nations will be hard to reverse. Given these circumstances, it is important to consider what meaningful international and domestic governance of autonomous weapons looks like, right? And then they argue like what a regulation regime ought to look like, and you can go back and look at that. But the basic argument you make here is, look, Judge, if the big three powers have already made up their mind that this is going to happen, right, then it's going to happen. And we have to choose between an imaginary world situation where we do a ban and like it magically fixes all the problems, or alternatively a real world situation where we have effective regulation. And you can look to the piece from Arkin and others that we just talked about. It's called A Path Toward Reasonable Autonomous Weapons Regulation for ideas on this, right? An analogy would be, for example, if you're a realistic policymaker, you can have two different choices. One is you can completely ban all alcohol, right? Or alternatively, you can have a policy where you encourage and maybe pay for designated drivers. In the real world, banning alcohol, as we've seen, like with prohibition, has tragic results. And although in theory it might be great in your magical debate world if nobody drank alcohol, in the real world they will, right? So a better policy would be a more moderate one of like encouraging designated drivers, and a better policy here would be one of, let's regulate it, let's slow it down, let's have countries, have transparency, and let's take our time on it, but let's not try to ban it entirely, right? And that relates to kind of a final argument, which is that if you do try a ban, you're just going to cede the technology of LAWs to, bad actors, to the most aggressive countries. And this is the idea that like the countries that actually want to follow LAWs in some of the literature right now are countries that, typically have followed international law in the past, whereas countries like the United States, yes, the United States and Russia are the ones that are really pushing forward with the development. And these historically have been some of the most aggressive countries that go out and have these international foreign, military adventures in the past. So what you're going to do is just further exacerbate the distinction between the countries that have the military technology to go out and have massive wars in the Middle East and things like that, and those that don't, right? And a ban is just going to basically cede that territory to countries that don't care about international law, and the United States right now is one of those, right? And so those are some of the negative arguments. Like we said, lots of good angles on both sides. That honestly, I hate it. We don't even really scratch the surface of all the potential stuff, but that's kind of a good, sort of flavor of everything. So with that, let's take just 1 second, come back with some final thoughts. All right, so final thoughts. Just two things really quickly. As you can see from what we've talked about so far, this is a resolution with many different angles. We didn't even really get into a lot of the geostrategic, like specific arguments about like playing out specific scenarios between specific countries like India and Pakistan and that sort of stuff, because there's just not time. But this is a topic where you will be rewarded for work and you will be punished for laziness, right? Because there's just enough different angles that you can absolutely get caught flat-footed. And if you're a really good debater that expects to be in late break rounds at every tournament, but you get caught flat-footed on something you haven't researched in double octos or whatever, or octofinals or whatever, well, there's only so much you can do about that. So allocating a little time every night to read a little bit more, to read from the sources we cite, to read from the sources that you find on other like blogs about, debate topics and things like that, it will pay off. The discipline and the time you spend to just sort of catalog the different arguments, write the blocks, be methodical, it will pay off on a broad topic with a lot of different angles. The second thing is this is very much a topic about telling stories and giving narratives. You cannot assume a lot of knowledge by judges, even about what we're talking about when it comes to lethal autonomous weapons. And so telling stories about how AIs can get out of control, or on the other hand, how lethal autonomous weapons can sacrifice themselves willingly without any hesitation, and in order to avoid civilian casualties. These are arguments that require explanation, talking about how let's see if we can have safe AI waiters and mechanics and doctors before we have AI killing machines, right? Simple language, simple stories that explains the narrative, because you don't have like a lot of existing statistics to beat people over the head with. You're going to have potentially important tournaments on this topic, some qualifying tournaments to nationals. Unfortunately, it looks like your nationals are going to be online this year, but hey, getting there is still a massive honor. It's the same resume item for college applications, whether it's online or in person. So, really put in the effort on that. So anyway, thanks very much for your patience as we got this video out. Again, crazy month for us, crazy month for the world, but we got it done. So I wish you guys the very, very best of luck. Proud of you for sticking with it through this pandemic. Some debaters are not, but you guys are the ones who are. And so we'll close with the usual. We always say, which is debate is for everybody. So remember, work hard, have fun, and hail state.